Hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favorite books that I read over the summer. Today is officially the first day of fall, even though it doesn't quite feel like it yet, and it's hard to believe. I don't really know where the last few months, last 6 months went. But summer is over, we are now on to the fall, so I thought it would be fun to look back at what I read over the summer and what my favorites were. I looked back at everything I read and picked my top 10 favorite books, and I'm going to be going through them in a rough ranking, kind of the way I do with my wrap-up videos, where this order is based on how I'm feeling today. It might change on a different day based on my mood, but I'll talk about these books in ascending order, starting from the book that I liked the least, although these were all favorites, and I'll go up and I'll end with my favorite book of the summer. So let's get started. The first book I want to talk about is one that I really haven't talked about very much on this channel, and I kind of regret not reviewing it back when I read it, which was towards the beginning of the summer. It's The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, which is the first book in his Dandelion Dynasty series. I had a lot of thoughts about it when I read it, so I don't really know why I didn't review it, except that there were a lot of other books I was reviewing at the time. I was right in the middle of my Hugo Awards reading project, and I just didn't quite have the bandwidth because I felt like it was going to be a big review if I did it. So I think I did share some thoughts about The Grace of Kings in my wrap-up. I forget what month it was, but I'll see if I can find that out. But it's a book that really interested me, so I'm sorry that I didn't spend more time promoting it on the channel, but I'll mention it now. Ken Liu is really better known for, first, I guess he has some short story collections, which I have not read, and he is also known for doing translations of Chinese science fiction into English, which I also have not read and probably should read at some point. The Grace of Kings is very different than either of those things. It's a very sprawling, epic fantasy that feels kind of like reading a historical epic, basically. I kind of hesitate to use the word Chinese inspired because I feel like Asian inspired is kind of this blanket term that could mean a ton of different things. In this case, The Grace of Kings is heavily influenced by the history of Han Dynasty China, something that I knew very little about until I read the book and then looked it up. But a lot of the characters are apparently pulled straight from that history/mythology. The world itself, I guess you could say that it is Chinese inspired, but it is very much not a parallel to historical China. It has its own geography and cultures and world building, but it definitely does feel Chinese or Asian rather than completely westernized. It took me a while to get into the book because honestly, especially at the beginning, it's kind of dry. It really does feel like reading some sort of historical epic classic or something more sprawling. You don't relate to the characters all that deeply. You do get to care about them as the book goes on, but it feels kind of like reading about historical figures. It's pretty honest about what their good points and bad points are. So if that's the kind of story that you enjoy reading, if you like reading historical epics, I think it's something that would really appeal to you. The main conflict of the story is really between these two rebel leaders. One of them is the descendant of a noble family, and he's basically almost a superhuman warrior. His name is Malice, and he is basically everything, the epitome of what a warrior should be. He's noble and brave and strong, and he sees honor in a very straightforward way, and his world is really a world of nobility and aristocracy. And then his friend, who later becomes his rival, Kunigaru, is originally kind of a criminal. He doesn't quite go all the way into the criminal territory, but definitely associates with the less savory types. He's a commoner, and he works his way up through a combination of luck and fate and also his own intelligence. But his concern and his world is really the world of the common people and seeing what this political situation and what all this war is like for them. So these two characters who have very different ways of approaching war and politics end up coming into conflict with each other, and you have to read the book to see who ends up winning out. I don't think this is going to be a series that's for everyone. It did take me a while to get into. It does feel kind of impersonal. You jump around between a lot of different characters. You have the main ones, but also you get point of views that are very brief. I think if you like historical epics and politics and war and the fate of nations, and you don't mind things feeling a little impersonal at times, and like you don't really get to know the characters or get inside their heads, in great detail, then I think this could be something you would really enjoy. I feel like it's really well done, and it felt like something I hadn't really seen before, both in the way the Chinese influence in history was used and also just the style, the combination of complicated world building and history that was kind of tied to real world history, but was also this complete retelling and was kind of done in its own way. So I thought it was kind of unique. In some ways it felt very familiar, and in some ways it felt very different. The next book I want to talk about is Malice by Gwynne. This is one that has been all over BookTube. I posted up a review fairly recently. This one also took me quite a while to get into, but I ended up totally loving it. I don't think it's a perfect book, and I did have some issues with it, but you can watch my review if you want to find out more about my thoughts. Overall, it's a very well done, very traditional fantasy, feels very pan-European with not terribly well-defined cultures. There's a chosen one plot that I finished book 2 recently. I'm quite liking how the chosen one plot is going, and I can't say that's something that I ever expected to say, but I am enjoying it. The action feels really good and high stakes. The characters are also really pretty well written and enjoyable. It really evokes a lot of the things that got me into fantasy in the first place. I'm really enjoying the series despite a few issues with it, and I definitely recommend Malice if you're looking to check out more traditional fantasy right now, or you haven't read any in a while, but you kind of want something that will bring you back in a really good way. Another book that I read over the summer and really enjoyed, despite the fact that I didn't talk about it too much on the channel, was This Tender Land by William Kent Krueger. I still can't remember why I even picked this book up. I got it from the library. It's historical fiction set during the Great Depression, and I really like historical fiction, but I haven't been reading it too much lately, and I don't know where I even heard about this book, and I've never read anything else by the author. I think a lot of what he writes is apparently a really long-running mystery series, which I have to say, after looking at it, I'm not that interested in. But This Tender Land is set during the Great Depression, I think around 1932. It follows 2 brothers and then 2 of their friends who escape from a really harsh boarding school in Minnesota, one of the schools that was set up basically to re-educate Native American children and take them away from their families. So these 2 brothers end up escaping along with 2 of their friends from the horrible headmistress of the school who really has it in for them, and they end up going on this coming-of-age type journey down the Mississippi River. They encounter all sorts of friends and foes along the way, and it has kind of a Mark Twain / The Odyssey feel. Both those comparisons really do feel pretty apt. You'll see if you read the book, but it was a very touching story, really emotional, and dealt with a lot of challenging emotional issues, but you were also really rooting for these kids. And yeah, I had 0 expectations for the book going in, but I ended up really enjoying it. So if you like historical fiction, then this might be something you'd be interested in checking out. It did have a few elements of the supernatural in it in kind of a literary way, but I definitely wouldn't classify it as anything other than historical fiction. A series I know I've mentioned a few times on this channel is the Finder series by Suzanne Palmer. It is science fiction, and it follows the adventures of Fergus Ferguson, an intergalactic repo man, basically, otherwise known as Finder. He tends to get himself into a lot of trouble and really gets sucked into causes rather than just sticking to business. The first book in this series I read last year, and that one is called Finder, and I actually just really unexpectedly liked it. Really liked the characters and the writing, and I had sort of low expectations. I thought it would just be sort of generic sci-fi, and it ended up really being the kind of series that I enjoy. The second book in the series came out this summer. It's called Driving the Deep, and I think in some ways it was even better than the first one, because in this one, Fergus is dealing with stuff that he has more personal stakes in. Fergus's friends, the shipmakers of Pluto, get kidnapped towards the beginning of the book, and he gets drawn into this whole situation, going undercover, trying to find where they are and rescue them. This is a fairly light science fiction series, but if you like mystery, adventure, detective type stories, then this series is a lot of fun. Another fairly light but really fun series that is just right up my alley that I started reading this summer is the InCryptid series by Seanan McGuire. The first book I ever read by Seanan McGuire is Middle Game, which I read for the Hugo Awards reading project. I overall enjoyed Middle Game, but had kind of a mixed reaction to it. There were things about her writing that I thought were really good, and then there were things about the book that I felt like didn't really work, but I am totally loving the InCryptid series so far. I'm going to count this as one book on my list of top 10, even though I read books 1 and 2. The InCryptid series is about a family of cryptozoologists, or you could call them monster hunters. They are in hiding from the Covenant of St. George, which is the organization that wants to destroy all cryptids. So they are simultaneously kind of trying to protect the supernatural population as well as study them. It's a very funny, wacky series with a large cast of characters. I really enjoy these series that are following extended families and you kind of get to know everybody in different books. There are also really hilarious side characters, a lot of wisecracking. Just generally, it's a very entertaining series. It's basically like candy. I can't recommend it to you as high literature, but if you want something really fun and you like the idea of trying urban fantasy, I think you should definitely try the InCryptid series. I hadn't read a lot of urban fantasy before, but I've just really been enjoying this series. I'm reading the 3rd book in the series right now, but the first 2 are Discount Armageddon and Midnight Blue Light Special. I really highly enjoyed both books in a very fun, silly way, and I think if you want some candy, you should definitely try them. The next couple of books I'm going to talk about are a little more substantial, but also books that I don't think I would recommend to everyone. The first one is The Raven Tower by Leckie. I have a review up of this. This was the book that I read once and didn't like until I got to the end, and then kind of realized what I thought the author was doing and reread it and ended up really loving it. It's basically a combination of a retelling of Hamlet and a story from the point of view of a god who is basically a giant rock. So yeah, I don't really know how to explain that too much better, but it kind of has these 2 parallel narratives. One's the present day story with the human characters, and the other one is the god telling almost its entire story. The book is told by the god, mostly in 2nd person, because the god is telling it to one of the human characters. So if you don't like 2nd person, actually, it might be worth a try. I feel like I've read several books in 2nd person recently, and I ended up quite liking it. It's not something I ever thought I'd end up going for, but I don't think The Raven Tower is going to be a book that everyone, or maybe even that many people, will enjoy, but I think if it's the kind of book that you like, it will really work for you. I'm still not entirely sure who to even recommend it to. It definitely comes across as feeling very literary. The Raven Tower is a book that I ended up thinking was pretty great, partly just due to being so different from anything else I had read. And also it's one of those things where when you read it, you feel like the author has executed what they wanted to do really, really well, and you might enjoy it or you might not, but you kind of have to admire the artistry in what Leckie did with that book. Probably my 2nd most eagerly awaited book of the summer was Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, the sequel to Gideon the Ninth. Harrow was probably the weirdest book that I've ever read, and I am someone that enjoys reading weird books. It had a lot of 2nd person. The main character was basically having a breakdown for the whole story. Reality was fairly unclear. There was a pretty good payoff at the end of the book, and I definitely couldn't put it down, and I am really looking forward to reading both Gideon and Harrow in the near future, so I have to say it was a pretty effective middle book in the trilogy. I just definitely think how I feel about the whole series will very much depend on how all of these things get resolved in book 3, because I have a lot of unanswered questions as well as getting a few answers. I definitely admired the fact that Tamsyn Muir wasn't afraid to take what worked with Gideon and throw most of it out the window to write this incredibly wild book. To me, I feel like the book accomplished something. No, I really did enjoy it. I'm really excited for book 3. Honestly, it can't come soon enough. So given that, I have to say, I think it was a pretty effective book. The next one I'll mention is The Relentless Moon by Robinette Kowal. I really need to film a review of this book. I'm planning to do that soon. I finished it a few weeks ago. I just haven't gotten around to filming the review yet. This is book 3 in the Lady Astronaut series, which is an alternate history science fiction story about what would have happened if a meteor hit the east coast of the United States in 1952, and this caused climate change to the point where Earth was going to become uninhabitable, and the space program had to get accelerated, and so it follows astronauts in this early days space program while they are trying to get humanity off the planet. As much as I enjoyed the first two, I thought the Relentless Moon was probably the best one yet. I really enjoyed the main character. I loved the fact that she was a 50-year-old woman who had a ton of different life experiences and a very complex skill set. It felt very true to life in how she was as a character and the other characters around her, and just continued fleshing out this world in a very interesting way. Overall, I read a lot of great books this summer, and when I was trying to do some sort of ranking by order, it was really pretty hard because a lot of these books are very different from each other. Some of them are pretty serious and others are very fluffy. But when I was trying to decide what my top two were, it wasn't easy, but right now, based on how I'm feeling, at least this week, I really have to put Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft in my number 2 spot. This wasn't necessarily the ranking I was expecting to do, but when I think back to what was the most interesting, what was the most unique, what's really sticking with me right now, I feel like Senlin Ascends is really up there. I have a pretty recent review of this book, so I'll link to that, but Senlin Ascends is the story of Thomas Senlin, a headmaster from a small village who goes on a honeymoon with his new wife and immediately loses her and has to try to find her and get her back. And because of this, he ends up going on a very strange adventure and having to find a side of himself that he didn't know existed and really change and transform as a character. I loved the writing in this book. It was very beautifully written. The character writing and the style of the characters felt very Dickensian, and the whole setting is kind of steampunky gas lamp fantasy-ish, I would say, but very, very hard to categorize. I'm going to have to wait and reserve judgment on this series until I keep going with it because I've only read the first book so far, but it really is something very, very different and something very special, and I'm looking forward to continuing with it. So I think because of that, I'm going to have to rank Senlin Ascends as my number 2 book that I read this summer. And now for my number 1 book, my favorite thing that I read in the last 3 months. This probably won't come as a surprise to most of you, but it's going to be The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. I have loved the Daevabad trilogy for years, ever since I read the first book, and I was waiting for years for the series to finally be finished. I mean, she did put the books out at a pretty good rate, I cannot blame her, but I was just so obsessed with this series. It has been a really big part of my brain for the last few years. I love the world and the lore. I love the way that S.A. Chakraborty used a ton of different mythology from different Middle Eastern countries to create this fantasy world in a way that feels very authentic because everything she used in it was true to the mythology. She didn't really contradict anything in mythology. She just kind of took it and built upon it to create a well-developed fantasy world. I loved the characters, and I thought the writing in The Empire of Gold was some of the best in the trilogy. I felt like she finally hit her stride in terms of the character development and making the characters and the character growth feel very believable and likable. Even the characters that I was not so crazy about in previous books, I really liked how they developed in book 3, and it was just a really satisfying conclusion to a series that I loved. So I really had a great journey with the Daevabad trilogy. I think it's going to remain one of my favorite series for a while. I'm so happy that it ended in a satisfying way, and because of that, Empire of Gold was definitely my favorite book that I read this summer, both because of how satisfying I found it and also because I was just waiting for it for so long and because of how much it meant to me. So I'd love to know what your favorite things that you read over the summer were. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything else that I should check out. And now we can all get started on our fall reading.